Renaissance, light in the darkness, and the legacy of modern Europe. Imagine yourself standing before Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, gazing up at the vibrant ceiling of the Sistine Chapel painted by Michelangelo, or reading the words of Copernicus that forever changed humanity's understanding of the universe. This is not just history. This is a revolution of thought. This is the Renaissance, a time when art, science, and philosophy erupted in brilliance, tearing through the darkness that had cloaked Europe for centuries, laying the foundation for the continent's global dominance in the centuries that followed. Out of the Dark Ages, even in the deepest darkness, the seeds of light quietly begin to sprout. As Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan resumed trade with the East, wealth poured in and gave rise to a new class, independent merchants and thinkers. They were no longer bound by the church nor by feudal nobility. They began to ask, what is man? How does the universe work? Can we understand the world through reason rather than blind faith? From these questions emerged a great awakening. Around the 14th century, in the very land that once was the heart of the Roman Empire, Italy, the light of knowledge began to blaze once more. The Renaissance was born, not as a political or religious movement, but as a spiritual revolution that stirred an entire continent from its slumber. No longer seeing humanity as lowly beings in need of salvation, the Renaissance celebrated humanism, uplifting intellect, creativity, and the dignity of man. In painting, Leonardo da Vinci didn't just portray beauty, he explored anatomy, machines, and dreams of flying. In architecture, Brunelleschi reconstructed the massive dome of Florence using pure mathematical logic. In astronomy, Copernicus, defying centuries of dogma, boldly declared that the Earth was not the center of the universe. That idea shook the foundations of faith and opened the doors to a new scientific revolution. The Renaissance not only revived classical wisdom, it ignited a new flame, the belief that humans could shape their own destiny through reason. Yet even as this light grew stronger, it faced looming shadows, the harsh grip of the church, religious wars between kingdoms. Still, the light spread. From Florence to Paris, Rome to London, Renaissance ideas inspired artists, scholars, and dreamers. It became an unstoppable wave, one that swept across the continent and ushered in a new era. From this point forward, European history would never be the same, for it entered a chapter where art, science, philosophy, and human curiosity blended into an unforgettable age. Rebirth and liberation. From the ashes of the medieval world, the Renaissance rose like a seismic shift that awakened European civilization. It was not just a revival of ancient art and knowledge, but a liberation of the human mind from the chains of outdated thought. Starting in Italy in the 14th century, the Renaissance quickly spread across Western Europe. In Florence, the economic, cultural, and political heart of the era, wealthy families like the Medici became patrons of artists, scholars, and scientists. From this city emerged timeless names: Leonardo da Vinci, the master of painting, science, and engineering; Michelangelo, the artist of myth and anatomy; Raphael, the embodiment of classical beauty. Yet, the Renaissance was more than art. It was a revolution of thought. Humanist philosophers like Petrarch, Erasmus, and Thomas More questioned the role of humanity, ethics, and society. They believed that knowledge could enlighten mankind, and that reason, not blind faith, was the true path to progress. In science, bold theories and inventions began to emerge. Nicholas Copernicus shattered millennia-old beliefs with his heliocentric theory. Galileo Galilei used a telescope to prove it, and nearly lost his life for being branded a heretic. But even in the face of opposition, Renaissance scientists kept pushing boundaries, slowly dismantling the constraints imposed by religious dogma. The Renaissance also fueled the age of great exploration. With improved navigation tools, compasses, accurate maps, and stronger ships, European powers began to reach out across the seas. Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. Vasco da Gama charted a sea route to India. Magellan proved the earth was round by sailing around it. These voyages brought back riches and fame. But more than that, they reshaped the global order. Europe, once fragmented and backward, now stood at the center of trade, knowledge, and power. But perhaps most importantly, this was the age that awakened the individual. Humans were no longer just tools of divine will. They were agents of history. Ideas of freedom, creativity, and limitless potential took root and would blossom in the revolutions to come, from politics to industry. In that sense, the Renaissance was not just a historical era. It was and remains a timeless symbol of humanity's desire to rise beyond limits, a flame that still burns in us today. From the light of knowledge to the rise of colonialism. As the light of Renaissance knowledge spread across Europe, it not only transformed thinking and the arts, it also ignited an unprecedented drive for expansion in human history. The geographical discoveries of the late 15th century turned distant lands into targets of European ambition. The sea routes pioneered by Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan gave Europeans access to resources never before touched. Gold and silver from the New World, spices from the East, and intercontinental trade routes that connected the globe. These discoveries elevated Europe to the heart of a newly forming global economy. But to maintain that position, Europe needed more than knowledge. It needed power. And that power came from conquest, exploitation, and domination. Colonialism was born. Empires like Portugal, Spain, England, France, and later the Netherlands and Germany began occupying territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Native lands with their own rich cultures were assimilated, exploited, and erased. Whole peoples were turned into tools, serving Europe's prosperity. At the same time, a new class was rising, the bourgeoisie. These were men who amassed wealth through trade, production, and investment. Not nobility by birth, but power in practice. This rising class became the engine of economic and industrial revolutions, eventually dismantling the feudal world that had ruled for centuries. The world had entered a period of dramatic transformation. From the rebirth of human thought to global conquest, Europe placed itself at the center. But in doing so, it also sowed the seeds of conflict, injustice, and upheaval that would explode in the centuries to come. The Industrial Revolution, when humanity began to accelerate. The scientific mindset of the Renaissance laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. From Isaac Newton with classical mechanics to Francis Bacon with the scientific method, they shaped the foundation of the modern scientific worldview. Technological inventions, from James Watt's steam engine to Richard Arkwright's factory systems, would not have existed without this intellectual legacy. The idea of pushing beyond limits became the guiding flame of the Western world for the next 3 centuries. Now imagine this. You're standing in the middle of the English countryside in the late 18th century. Before you, golden fields of wheat wave in the wind. In the distance, a small stream turns an old wooden mill wheel. Everything is slow, peaceful, just as it had been for hundreds of years. Then one morning, the ground begins to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the roar of steam engines. The first machines appear, trembling like newborn beasts, but carrying within them something never seen before. Locals gather to watch, eyes filled with a mix of confusion and wonder. What they don't yet realize is that they are witnessing a turning point in human history, the birth of the Industrial Revolution. It started quietly. A single spinning machine allowed one worker to do the job of 10. A steam engine could pull an entire train. A blast furnace, fueled by coal instead of wood, melted iron and steel like a cauldron of alchemy. These inventions began to change everything. Fields grew empty. Rivers no longer flowed peacefully. They were dammed, redirected, and drained to power factories. People left their villages, crowding into cities, where smoke filled the sky, steel wheels screeched, and clocks ticked without mercy. Factories mushroomed. Former farmers became factory workers, laboring 12, 14, even 16 hours a day in cramped, stifling conditions. Children as young as 7 joined the grind, hands covered in grease, eyes too tired to dream. Cities expanded, not through elegance, but through sweat, soot, and sorrow. And yet, amid the roar of machines and the quiet suffering of millions, something else was growing: ambition. Europe was no longer content with producing for itself. It needed cotton from India, rubber from Southeast Asia, gold and silver from Africa, markets in Latin America. And so, steel ships set sail, armed with guns, maps, and the flags of empires. Colonialism was no longer just military conquest. It became a global hunt for resources to feed the ever-hungry industrial machine. In Paris, London, and Berlin, bourgeois gentlemen toasted with wine under golden chandeliers. Meanwhile, in the colonies, native workers toiled to exhaustion, supplying raw materials for factories they would never see, on a continent they would never visit. Everything had changed. No longer confined to fields or churches, mankind now commanded iron, steam, and electricity. They laid down railroads, invented the telegraph, and finally harnessed electricity, bringing light into the night. The Industrial Revolution set the world in motion at a speed never seen before, but it also split humanity in two. On one side, the creators of machines, wealthy, powerful. On the other, those who operated them, poor, weary, uncertain of tomorrow. From those first turning wheels of iron, humanity had entered a new chapter, a chapter of speed, production, struggle, and conflict. And no one could have predicted that this acceleration would soon bring the world closer to the most devastating wars in history. The dark side of glory, when light became fire. The Industrial Revolution ushered in a golden age for Europe, a time of roaring machines, glowing factories, and flourishing knowledge. But like every flame, that light cast shadows, and the shadow it brought was long, cold, and devastating. As production soared and clocks no longer measured time but profit, the great European powers grew hungry. Hungry for resources, for markets, for power. And they turned their eyes outward. From Asia to Africa, from the Middle East to Latin America, Europeans raised the banner of enlightenment, but beneath that banner were guns, swords, and chains. What were once voyages of discovery had become systematic invasions. Ancient civilizations were crushed, indigenous communities were erased, Native Americans were hunted, Indians were exploited. Africa became a reservoir of slaves. They called it a civilizing mission, but in truth, it was plunder and extraction to the bone. Those who once prided themselves on knowledge and reason now used science to justify injustice. Racial science, civilization rankings, and inhuman theories were created to excuse brutality. And then, that shadow didn't just fall upon the colonies. It began to consume Europe itself. As the 19th century drew to a close, the European empires, now too vast, too powerful, too ambitious, began to clash. Nationalism, once a force to break free from the church, was twisted into extremism, placing one nation above all others. Germany, a young empire, unified late, possessed immense industrial might and burning national pride. In their eyes, Britain and France had already divided the world's spoils too generously. Germany wanted space, resources, colonies, and a rightful seat at the global table. The arms race began. Nations poured money into armies, hoarded weapons, developed warfare technologies. Inventions once meant to explore the universe or understand the human body were now redesigned to kill more efficiently. More powerful explosives, longer-range artillery, armored battleships, poison gas, all were the result of science in the hands of empire. And then came 1914. One gunshot in Sarajevo shattered the fragile chains linking the great powers. World War I erupted, a nightmare of blood, mud, and ash. Over 16 million people died. An entire generation of European youth was wiped out. A continent, once the symbol of intellect and civilization, had become the bloodiest battlefield humanity had ever seen. But the tragedy didn't end there. When the war was over, hatred, division, and ambition still smoldered among the defeated. In a shattered Germany, a thirst for revenge began to rise, and with it, fascism. Once again, nationalism merged with extremism. Science was twisted into weapons of mass murder, and human intellect was dragged into the darkest night of history, into genocide, gas chambers, and atomic bombs. And so the question must be asked, did the light of the Renaissance, the very force that brought us knowledge, humanity, and art, betray everything it had built? Or was it humanity itself, in its unrelenting pursuit of progress, that pushed too far and fell into the abyss? The 20th century, the rise and decline of a once dominant continent. As the fires of the Second World War faded, Europe was no longer what it once was. Cities, once glowing with Renaissance architecture and industrial strength, lay in ruins. Bustling squares were now deserted. Survivors, even those who escaped physical harm, were left with souls torn apart by war. At that moment, there was no denying it. Europe had collapsed, but from the ashes came the will to rebuild. The United States, now the world's new superpower, poured funds into the Marshall Plan, helping to rebuild Western Europe. Railroads were laid anew, factories restarted, democratic institutions and welfare systems were reshaped. In West Germany, the very nation that had unleashed the horrors, the people did not wallow in sorrow. They rebuilt with the steady persistence of gears turning again. From rubble rose the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that made West Germany one of the strongest industrial powers in the world within decades. In France, Britain, and Italy, another question loomed: how can we ensure that war never happens again? And the answer was unity. But the European Union began as a coal and steel community and slowly expanded. Nations once bitter enemies now shared resources, markets, people, and borders. A dream emerged of a new Europe, peaceful, civilized, and prosperous. In the second half of the 20th century, Europe became like an old sage, no longer arrogant, but calm and wise. The focus shifted to quality of life, social welfare, healthcare, and education. Many European countries became models of human rights and cultural richness. But beneath that calm surface, cracks began to show. The quiet decline. As the world stepped into the 21st century, the pace of technological advancement, globalization, and geopolitical competition grew fiercer than ever, and Europe, once the center of the world, began to fall behind. While the United States and China raced ahead in technology, artificial intelligence, and space exploration, much of Europe found itself trapped in slow growth, an aging population, and internal divisions. The 2008 financial crisis, followed by sovereign debt crises in Greece, Spain, and Italy, shook the foundations of the European Union. A wave of immigration from the Middle East and Africa triggered ethnic tensions and deepened societal rifts. Brexit in 2016, when the United Kingdom officially left the EU, was like a crack in a glass pane that once seemed unbreakable. Then came Russia-Ukraine 2022. The specter of war returned, knocking on Eastern Europe's door, threatening the very order that had taken decades to build. Today, Europe, though still a cultural and political powerhouse, no longer holds undisputed dominance. The values it once championed, freedom, democracy, human rights, are now challenged from both within and without. While China expands its influence through economic power and the Belt and Road Initiative, and the United States remains the global leader in military and technology, Europe struggles to redefine itself. The big question: where is Europe headed? Can a continent that once lit up the world, and from the Renaissance to the scientific revolution, from humanism to timeless art, still write its next chapter? Or will Europe become a glorious memory, like ancient Rome, like Athens, living only in books and museums? History has never stopped, and humanity has never stopped watching Europe, the cradle of ideas that once reshaped the entire world. When the light fades, Europe on the edge of decline. In 2015, at Keleti railway station in Budapest, thousands of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq pitched makeshift tents, sleeping on the cold concrete floor, waiting for a chance to enter Germany. That scene was not just a humanitarian crisis. It was a stark reminder that Europe was facing a chaotic world it could no longer control. The refugee crisis shook the very foundation of trust in the European Union. From small towns in Hungary and Poland to the streets of Paris and Berlin, a wave of anti-immigration sentiment rose. Far-right parties, once seen as fringe and radical, began gaining seats in parliaments. Germany, the country that once opened its doors to over 1 million refugees, now faced deep internal divisions, both cultural and political. At the same time, the economies of several EU member states began to falter. Greece, once the cradle of Western philosophy, fell into a severe debt crisis. By 2010, it stood on the verge of default, forcing the EU to inject hundreds of billions of euros in bailout funds. But the price was steep, a wave of austerity measures that left citizens in poverty, joblessness, and growing resentment. Italy, heir to the grandeur of ancient Rome, struggled under the weight of public debt and an aging population. Historic cities like Naples and Venice not only faced physical decay, but were increasingly abandoned by younger generations migrating in search of work. France, the nation of light, of art, of revolution, plunged into waves of protest. From the yellow vests to retirement reforms and climate demonstrations, citizens flooded the streets as if they no longer believed in the system at all. And then came the final blow, Brexit, 2016. The United Kingdom, one of the EU's founding pillars, voted to leave in a bitterly contested referendum. Behind the Leave vote were millions who felt left behind by globalization, immigration, and decisions from Brussels that seemed detached from everyday reality. Europe, once proud of its unity, peace, and stability, was now cracking from within. Meanwhile, on the eastern frontier, a different fire was smoldering: Russia, Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the entire security architecture of Europe was thrown into jeopardy. The Baltic states, Poland, Finland, all braced for a new war. Energy prices soared, inflation returned, and once again, the specter of war appeared on a continent that once vowed never again. No one speaks of a post-war world anymore. Reality has made it clear: peace is never guaranteed. All of these are not isolated events. They are fragments of a larger portrait, a Europe slowing down while the rest of the world surges ahead. China is building infrastructure across Asia and Africa. The United States dominates technology, data, and innovation. India, Brazil, ASEAN, once overlooked, are now rising, reshaping the global map of influence. And Europe? It still has the most beautiful museums, the cleanest streets, the deepest intellectual archives, but it is also a place now forced to ask hard questions about itself and about its place in a world that no longer looks the same. The end of a legend and the question that remains for the future. Europe was once the heart of the world, a place where art was carved into stone, where knowledge was written into books, and where blood was spilled in pursuit of freedom. From the darkness of the medieval ages, they lit the fire of the Renaissance. From the ruins of world wars, they built a union. They once led humanity with the sword, with ideas, with the light of reason. But now, as the world has changed, as the old order fades and new powers rise strong and fast, Europe stands at a crossroads in history. No longer a ruler, but not yet the forgotten. Just a continent trying to adapt, trying to find its voice again in the noise of a new century. Perhaps what Europe needs most today is not military might, not miraculous economic growth, but something much simpler: to remember who it is. A land that once gave birth to Socrates, Galileo, Voltaire, and Kant. A place that once dared to ask the biggest questions and seek answers through reason, courage, and faith in humanity. If Europe can still hold on to that, then that light has not gone out. Thank you for listening. If you found this content meaningful, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. And don't hesitate to leave your thoughts or questions in the comments below. Many thanks.